Hello everyone, today we explore the deep symbolic, mythological and historical interconnections between the horse, fire, iron metallurgy, shamanic practices and sacred warfare across Eurasian traditions, particularly from the late antique to early medieval periods. And at its core, this video examines how the mounted warrior clad in iron, exemplified by figures like St. George in Christian iconography or nomadic armored horsemen, embodied a fusion of technical innovation, heavy cavalry, and superior metallurgy and magic religious meanings. Celestial versus chthonic forces, or more and better synchrosis between the two, initiatory smithing, spirit combat. This fusion made such warriors appear invincible, transforming battles into sacred struggles long before formalized historical documentation through, for example, the Christianization, and so sort of the recording and framing of the religions of the book provided theological imagery of the same. I already made multiple videos on this topic, especially the one about probably the birth of what will eventually become St. George's knightly iconography, which is appearing, essentially developing with the same exact characteristics in the 3rd century BC, in the lower Danubian area in Thrace. All right, we used a lot of iconography from that very time and place to show that. We also talked a lot about the military historical development of cavalry. Not so much about cataphracts, but we made multiple videos in particular about sort of the development of Eurasian mounted warfare, its technicalities, the barding, armor, how the cataphract was essentially a response to sedentary civilizations. In the case of the Sakas specifically, that were the ones pioneering this for a while, the arrival of Alexander on the Syr and beyond. I have incidentally started a couple of months ago a series, as you know, about Alexander in Afghanistan, and sort of the grand finale has to do with that. But I also discuss the same in a very old video about Scythian tactics. There is really a lot into this because we're taking, as we were anticipating before here, more like the anthropological, spiritual, but also probably the metallurgical today side of the story, the equine symbolism. St. George, as you know, is a historical Roman soldier and Christian martyr from Cappadocia, modern central Turkey, executed around 303 under Diocletian, who enacted, in fact, some of the bloodiest persecutions of Christians. I have videos on his reign, and actually multiple ones. St. George becoming venerated, famously enough, as the dragon slayer in legends that, however, first appear fairly late in time, in essentially 11th century Georgian texts, and spreading rapidly in Byzantine culture by the 12th, right? Actually, the motive of the Drachenkampf and other similar symbolism is out there because, again, here we're talking, again, St. George, I said it before, the specific iconography that eventually overlaps with one of the saints here dates back to a time where it's not just like that appeared because they created it in the moment on the Danube in the 3rd century BC, but because it was at some point represented as such before, just mostly conceptualized and lived, right? Such sculptures were not particularly big in representation. It actually constitutes, in a very ancestrally, traditional and primal way, actually a degeneration of just active and non-contemplative, or at least not sort of lost in artistic representation lifestyle, right? Now, the dragon slaying motive draws from pre-Christian motives, such as Perseus rescuing Andromeda, or, as we just said, the Thracian hero cults of mounted youths trampling chaos beasts. The meaning we've seen even in the representations of the Virgin in Christianity as she beats essentially her own chthonic dimension, as is transfigured by the god Father and Son at the same time. So she stands on the half crescent and sometimes also on the snake, crushing the head of a snake. There are, as we will learn better today, naturally very dual, but not dualistic for that matter, because there is always a radical moral hierarchy in this. Symbology about the role of the snake. For example, Athena controls that as with her staff. There is obviously a sense of still today in medicine, in the Hippocratic legion, right? The idea that you must be somehow immunize yourself in order to win, to dominate the evil element, right? And this is the same in Siegfried. This is the same in Christ, actually, that literally claims to be the snake of Moses' staff and more, because that's the cure, right? In other words, if you fully embrace, right, the idea of transcending your own mortality, if you immunize yourself in this sense against venom, you can fully embrace that and surpassing it and dispelling it, as fear is the only reason why we're mortal in the first place. And so this is actually a very wide, as you understand, universal traditional concept that we've seen essentially emerging from any single theological background, from the Indo-Europeans to the Semites and so on, and being, if anything, just approached by different degrees, considering the moral temper of these peoples, but the mechanism being completely identical. It's the symbol of good triumphing over evil, of course, or order over primordial disorder, but it contains in itself the key to that achievement. It's not a mere display of victory. It also encodes, right, in its language, the know-how for attaining it, right? And going back, for example, to Byzantine icons, some of them display George's horse as red and fire-breathing, emphasizing its solar, heavenly nature in contrast to the dragon's watery, underworld chaos. We've seen how red definitely represents the sun itself in the ancient concept of sacred royalty. Think about Ra. We've seen it even in the videos about the Hermetic tradition. Thus, there is always a specific meaning for all of these colors, and the fact that, for example, the Byzantines themselves would maintain that, as many other cultures, as definitely not a simple color decoration, is speaking of how continuous within Christianity as well this concept is, and how it could have not been understood otherwise or done without. The symbolic dimension of the horse in St. George's dragon fight emerges vividly in these Byzantine iconographic traditions, with the saint riding a red steed that exhales sparks along with thick smoke from its nostrils, a vivid portrayal of a fire-breathing creature that in this sense is also very similar to the dragon, as a matter of fact, right? So an element that must be tamed, in this sense transfigured, becoming constitutive to the same knight, because in many ways the horse is just like a prosecution, right? An extension of the same transfigured hero, right? Is also the mean through which he can achieve heaven, but it's mythologically connected with very powerful chthonic origins as well. Think about the same Pegasus, for example, properly emerging from the waters, right? As also Venus, the most chthonic feminine symbol. And in this sense, and this is very alive, especially in the Indo-European tradition, notoriously enough, the horse in fact represents this dual standard, like in the same myth of the chariot in Plato, right? There is the black horse, untamed, that tries to bring you down, but your point is to tame it yourself, as Bucephalus for Alexander, that also, in fact, owed much to theology itself. The untamed horse, nobody really can tame except the young, the the Apollo that emerges as Alexander did as the world conqueror and the beginner of a new era, right? So the fact that red is connected with the sun, and that, however, it's also quite intensely associated with the power of fire that can and will, like in the Soma, burn and destroy anyone who is not fit, in fact, for receiving it. And when the horse is finally tamed, it actually turns white, right? And just like the absolute power, purity, immaculate divinity. This is relevant because, as we've seen in the videos about sacred royalty, the image of the sun is not a static one. It's not one of essentially absolute serenity and divine perennialism, right? It's the symbol of the sacred ruler in particular. So the one who is actually rising as and to the sun, but that as far as an earthly reality exists below the divine one, this guy is becoming, or rather is struggling in a place distant from man and God, and as such, he has this color of tracing an arc, fundamentally, and specifically connecting with the divine solar symbolism, but also the transcending phase that allows you to reach that. So the fact that the horse here is represented with even some etheric, dragon-like tonic traits is fascinating, because it also speaks of our concept of hell and how fundamentally power still agitates within that, and how the fire here is, if anything, destroying all the enemies of faith, and therefore of the sacred, the victorious ruler. Right. Now, this trait also unmistakably ties the animal to the element of fire, this particular images of Byzantine tradition. By contrast, we have already seen, for example, in other videos, how the horse's association in other settings with aquatic powers and the underground world arises quite dually from the other side. Right? We just remembered Pegasus. The loyal mount of this dragon slaying, that is properly Sauroktonos saint, embodies a distinct solar and heavenly essence. I think of the classical Hellenic hoplites wielding their spears with the posterior tip called a sauroter, right? Literally the lizard killer. And you would be surprised by how, so we made an abundant amount of videos on Hellenic Dorian tradition. This meaning is not merely sort of material or technical, like you have this, butt of the spear that you fix on the ground and or you use to finish off fallen enemies. So you call it lizard killer. No, this definitely derives from the higher concept of Apollo slaying Python, and therefore the idea that whoever fell in that regard was truly an inferior being and had to be finished off by also getting, at the same time, all of the wisdom and the power of the slain with you. Right. Also because, as you know, in the symbol, the dragon snake changes skin. It is sort of such an underworldly, but in this sense also supernatural being that shows eternal regeneration, or not only just always more enemies to slain, assaulting you from every side, and in fact hidden in the grass. This can be the humble but still potentially lethal peltas that can take out a Spartiate, for example, out of the blue, as they actually going to do. I also described this in the battle and campaign of Pylos and Sphacteria, for that matter. But you're truly meant to dress this dragon's skin, right? The Longobards in early medieval Italy in the Duchy of Benevent are recorded playing some equestrian games that are very similar to the one of the later jousts, where they have to pierce a target at gallop, that in this case was actually some viper's skin that apparently the same Longobards warriors, once having, trusted and in the sense won with their weapons, would have eaten to symbolize this further rejuvenation, right? The result of the epic duel pitting the Celestian charger against a dragon that personifies watery chthonic disorder carries deep allegorical weight. In fact, it stands for the timeless opposition pitting the life-affirming, structuring forces descending from the sky against the amorphous, destabilizing energies concealed in lower, infernal realms. As we'll understand now, however, these forces are obviously entwined, right? They exist within all of us at the same time, and the connection between the two is the key to victory and eternal life. This fire-horse connection in myth feeds into a broader pattern shared by Indo-European and Turco-Mongol lore alike, in particular because, of course, the centrality of the horse in these steppe cultures. The bond between fire and equine figures underpins yet another association, the intimate tie linking fire to metals, which is also today's topic. I made a couple of videos about metallurgy, never quite in a fully technical sense. It's a very interesting as complicated field, also because it's continuously evolving from a historiographical point of view. At some point we'll be even sort of ever more technical regarding how did they actually create weapons, for example. What kind of characteristics could they confer to it? There is all a history, this and so on. I made a video about swords in Irano-Germanic culture, which explains a little bit at least how the product was handled. At some point I talk about Germanic swords in the early and the high Middle Ages. I talked about the Celtic metallurgical legacy in Romano-Germanic panoplies, and so on. Today we go even further back in time, right, and trying to connect the aforementioned shamanic, sort of even probably lower chthonic Dionysian element of the horse with the highest, right, imperial Catholic divine one, right? Much like that remarkable animal of the horse, metals, most prominently iron, trace back to a double source that in and of itself can be, as the white and the black horse respectively, Uranian and chthonic in origin. They arrive either, in fact, as meteoric material plunging in flames from above, or as earthly ore drawn up from below via the deliberate mastery of fire. Right, so meteorites, or at least in that sense, everything that fell from heaven, including how planets were formed in a sense, pertains to the fall. Therefore, originally, from a divine source like everything, as we've seen in the Hermetic tradition, this is the entire point of later alchemic thinking, right? There is a properly chemical, material, natural philosophy that, however, is also highly metaphysical and metaphorical in different ways, that observes how the more concretized matter is truly the key through its own resurgence, its own dissolution into a higher divine principle. And so you can argue, as far as the Hermetic tradition is concerned, that this started from a very long time ago in connection with, in fact, this divine Uranian celestial origin of especially the most resistant meteoritic material. A similar horse-iron dynamic, by the way, surfaces notoriously in Odin's mythic cycle. That's why I, for example, use Thor in the first image. We will, if anything, go back to that, but it interestingly flowed onward into Christian folk beliefs. One of them is Saint Eligius, a 7th century Frankish bishop and patron of smiths and farriers that surely owes to the Frankish Germanic, earlier Odinic beliefs that simply lived through the same tradition, not just of smithing, but of higher capacity of wielding swords, other metal weapons like properly the heavenly rulers. Think about the sacred blood of the Merovingian dynasty was concerned, and always living within that. Like, the more I study this stuff, and the more I can't help but reject any nonsensical assertion that at some point Christianity arrived and canceled these beliefs. Right? People do not seem to accept, in fact, in this kind of neopaganistic nonsense, that the reason why humanity is the way it is not Christianity. Right? Christianity at most can be the consequence of a previous degeneration, and so a religion applying to a very specific era in the history of mankind. It's not just switching, sort of, I don't know, we'll pass now back to neo-paganism, that you will come back to be a 7th century Frankish war. It doesn't work like that, right? And ignoring everything in between, over-fixating with these kind of, oh, look, this is what they should, and also with incredibly flat and, in fact, an academic approach to the matter, just a statistic memory on X. That's what it got into nowadays. Is if anything, making you further sclerotize in a contemplativistic iconism and self-inferiorization that is the one, in fact, that today have just the capacity to wield an iPhone, and definitely not a magic sword for that matter. In particular, the Legion of Saint Egidius, as you know, bears such metallurgical Odinic image through the overlapping identities of blacksmith and horseshoe maker, right? And these legions were very well and alive across all of Europe throughout the late Middle Ages, maintaining the original meaning. We also talk about this as far, for example, the preservation of horses' heads at the entrance of houses, of palaces. This was, again, you would think it's just something that disappeared, I don't know, at the latest during the Viking era. It was there, right, and understood by all Europeans, and also other peoples for that matter. It's just your own ignorance in history that tells how far, in fact, humanity has been separated from even basic dignity and existential worth. Now, earlier portions of our sort of videos dedicated to the rise, the birth of knighthood, already traced how the horse drove a sweeping technical military swift from late antiquity well into medieval armies. And even there, trying to separate sort of medieval knighthood from, I don't know, the European equestrian tradition is nonsensical. There wasn't a moment in which knighthood or chivalry were invented, I don't know, in the 3rd, 4th of the 12th century. That's basically just when somebody started to write down certain legions and certain codes that reflected certain particular political and social dynamics of the time. These values, for whoever has sort of a minimal introduction to the same, were millennia old and, again, universally shared by all peoples involved. We know them well across the Hellenic, the Roman, the Germanic world and beyond, the Celtic, for not talking, again, about steppe peoples, the Iranic branch, etc. Across exactly, however, those transitional centuries, the animal anchored a sprawling magical religious universe whose origins lay in the vast Eurasian grasslands stretching into Ciscaucasia and Transcaucasia before encompassing the Iranian uplands, as we'll see better now, come to be sort of more pronounced for the macroscopic reason of essentially a collapse of what had been classical antiquity, the Roman empires, all the great ecumenic empires that had existed up to that point. So the exhaustion of probably the fabric of individuals as free warriors, etc., and this is a massive, again, step in the sort of the various degeneration of probably from the various eras, that Rome had, according to tradition and prophecy before it, re-established the Golden Age in the Augustan era, which is also what the Christians, in fact, take for granted, definitely. And this was to leave, and this between the Bronze and the Iron Age, according to prophecy. And so after that, it's just like the Fourth Age, the one of the wolf. And in that moment, especially the mid-6th century, we know very well from a military point of view that cavalry surpasses infantry, right? Cavalry is not always beating infantry at this point. You have really to arrive to the mid-12th century for that to be the case, especially in sedentary Western Europe, but it is superior to infantry. And so together with that, we receive an incredibly larger amount of de facto feudal or proto-feudal knightly chivalric evidence that we mostly associate, as we were saying before, with the Middle Ages. And that tell us, in that sense, much about the further implementation, re-implementation, revival of not just the myths, the ideals, all over sedentary Europe. The hero was a horseman, right? So regardless of how armies at large fought, everybody fought mostly with infantry, right? But still, all these cultures still regarded the hero as a horseman. And the horse connected with, think about, the imperial Biga, or even the Vandal era, like the hero is a horseman, right? It's not that the Scandinavians had much cavalry compared, for example, to continental Europe, where at least you start knowing what kind of knightly force was emerging at that point. As such, we get, together with the technical side of the story, however, also a minimal revival or at some point just emergence from the mists of history, because just the times are more recent, we get more stuff. Contrary to what is commonly believed, medieval Europe had an overwhelming literary production. I also made some videos about this, and even there, just ignorance speaks for the opposite. It was from these heartlands we just mentioned, however, that heavily armored mounted warfare and equine reverence gradually diffused westward. I made a video about the origins of cavalry, right, or better, chariotry, mostly at that point. And we have an important amount of videos about late Bronze, early Iron Age warfare, showing how, especially in the Middle East, in the best documented military theaters, we can start witnessing to this sort of shift from a chariot-dominated tactical system to, in fact, a fully fledged cavalry arm proper. So not chariots, but probably horsemen. That had kind of always existed next to charioteers, telling the truth, but hadn't quite gained the cohesion and the compactness that instead will start. We can argue that that's when cavalry is born, essentially in the first, fully at least, in the first millennium BC as an arm. Any serious inquiry into the prehistory of the medieval knight, therefore, must go beyond viewing him merely as a man fighting from horseback, but the result of an incredibly sophisticated structure and integrated system of arms, literally, that had been refined, built up, and strengthened from millennia of history, together with a very specific cosmology, right? We will naturally talk about this more in the religious history videos. This is probably a military historical one, right? But it's crucial to understand how the knight really represented the fully equipped, heavily protected fighter whose weaponry displayed remarkable efficiency tailored to his combat environment, because he was pushed by a force, right, that was the cause, not the consequence, of his own panoply, One does not understand this, and that's why I started, by the way, the Indo-European theology series, to show how our forefathers literally, like, and we still mean speaking their language, follow a an extremely specific expansionist imperial ecumenic theology. Everything about our own language literally sounds like the process of cosmic recompaction, divine unity by the victorious charioteer and later knight, right? Dominating, conquering, transfiguring, divinizing the world in his own truly transcended image. Metals are key to this because they are the lowest part, as we've seen, of creation, or better, default from the divine. But in this sense, humans have to start from what exists in the world as all potentially divine in sort of power, hence the idea also of the magic sword, and depending on who wields that and the transcendence of all that mechanism and so on. And that's why metals underwent a strikingly parallel development during the same period. You cannot study the history of cavalry if you don't study the history of metallurgy. Extraction, in fact, intensified, refinement grew more precise, and conversion into high-quality arms and armor accelerated. Both horse and metal technologies became deeply interwoven with elaborate, varied complexes of magical and religious ideas. Some could see this as, well, these humans were basically, this was still technically in the age of heroes, I would say, in the Bronze one, or depending on where you want to really locate it, but at the time they, if a Mycenaean warlord in Dandra Panoply landed somewhere on an Hellenic island, that definitely might have been a demigod. And aside with his horses, well, for that, and they were brought everywhere. We've seen it very few about the Mariannas that really enter so prepotently as Indo-European terminologies of knightly chivalric warfare, also in properly Semitic languages. Mesopotamia is the best, is a privileged point of observation for that matter, for obvious reasons at this point. So that these humans were, however, still trying to cope with spiritual issues by using material mechanisms. Well, the history of chivalry had a sinusoidal trend as much as the one of knighthood, because again, they're not necessarily in sort of between the spiritual and material literally the same thing. But there is definitely, in fact, in the climatic phases of the sinusoidal trends, an increase once again. A need, a pressure that sort of purifies, that revives the necessary training and discipline to fight, like this psychophysically exhausting and incredibly sophisticated but also complicated and difficult knightly fashion that evidently was worth the investment, was normally astronomical for the, in fact, material costs of the time. We should really make a video about the cost, for example, of a crusader knight. By juxtaposing these technological and sacred spiritual aspects, one gains a clearer understanding of why the armored horseman standing on the cusp of the medieval era gathers such an overwhelming array of symbolic meanings and cultural prestige that he actually already possessed enough to make contemporaries regard him as virtually unbeatable, which is what you mostly gather from a Western perspective or a very specific part of the Middle Ages, in particular between the mid-12th and the beginning of the 14th century. That is, in fact, the peak of universal, imperial, feudal, also priestly power in the great medieval civilization, but how this vision was connaturated to the knight among many other peoples, and even, again, the sedentary ones in Europe in particular, with various waves of Indo-European conquests, remembered that model as the only true divine one, historically and mythologically. Now, metallurgy's earliest roots seem to lie in northeastern Persia. I say seem because, again, historiography goes fast. We have ever more sophisticated archaeological techniques, finds, even just in a primitive sense. It is, as you know, I'm extremely skeptical of the let's say leading capacity of a field essentially based on material, right? I am a historian, but my bias mostly derives from the fact that everything that basically people seem to archaeologically claim, whether it's in, I don't know, apologically or genetically or whatever, is basically what we already know, basically since ever. If you have any appropriate cultural historical education, was connaturated also, interestingly enough, in the ancient regime aristocratically to the elite, to the establishment that were exactly the descendants from these very knights. As I explained in many videos, it's not like knights cared very, or any military leader later in history cared about telling you how war was fought. They already knew how that was the case. We've seen it even, I don't know, in the armies of Henry IV, of Louis XIII, of France between the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century. There is nothing about a rationalization of warfare, about manuals telling you how to fight. Everything was really, they had religious texts, they had historical texts that obviously also contained much that can be more properly connected with warfare, in fact, from a spiritual standpoint, rather than one of example, rather than some strange material or technical elucubration. That was normally attributed to the third estate. The workers of the fourth were probably the ones at some point that just touched just that, because even the third estate's masters were directors, were leaders in a way, mostly specializing again in technical knowledge, but not even touching the damn thing, depending also where you're looking at. But the smith that is a dwarf, there is some sort of netherworlder, and it's dark, short, and ugly, and whatever. Like it's there, like it's obvious. It's the retinue man, the non-freeman of the knight/master, right? But we definitely see a lot going on in northeastern Persia, right? As the at least likely starting point from which skills in ore mining and metal shaping radiated to Central and East Asia as well, southward to the Indian region, and toward the Caucasus and Taurus ranges as well. And across all this territory, especially in Central Asia, in fact, as you know, a great deal of metallurgical innovations occurred, right? And interestingly enough, as we explained before, not much as a sort of spontaneous creation, or one simply correlated with military superiority in absolute terms, especially on a collective scale, but as a reaction against the ever sort of more courageous armies of the sedentary civilizations all around. Here we're talking, actually, as we'll see now, in probably the first half of the second millennium BC, and in origin, and with the greatest breakthroughs carried out apparently towards the end of the same millennium. So it's a very early age, right? Later routes carried these techniques apparently through Anatolia into Europe, including the Balkans and Noricum. This is important because the Balkans, as we've seen, received much of that sort of stepped knightly dimension, like the Thracians living on the left bank of the Danube were in fact historically mounted, right, differently from the ones on the other. Noricum will become, as we've seen also recently in the video about Celto-Germanic warfare, notoriously before the Upper Rhine in the High Middle Ages, the in fact ancient, most advanced arms and armor production region, right, the one from which the Calibus Noricum that the Romans used for their own panoplies was produced. There are all reasons why that is the case. This was not the only sort of well-placed region in Europe for arms and armor production. Iberia had, for example, a lot of that. There is a broader spread in any case. We'll see now with the Proto-Celts, Celts, in terms of arms and armor production. And in fact, as we will see now, actually a capacity of Europe to even send, in turn, to other continents, further waves of arms and armor culture. For example, in the High Middle Ages, notoriously, Europe was basically especially for the Eastern Europe, the Western Eurasian steppe, and so on, actually an exporter, right? And of arms and armor. The Khivans, for example, when you look at their iconic art drawn from the Byzantines, actually, when you look at archaeology, they tend, especially the elite, to use a big deal of German imports, right? There were also lots of Turkic influences in a way, and the same Byzantine ones, but it's worth remembering how fast, how quick movement actually was especially when you look at trade and when you look at people who had an interest to move. It's something that makes you really understand how world technology at the time did not know barriers, even across oceans, as a matter of fact. It's a very underrated aspect. Ironworking in particular began expanding significantly, as we were saying before, around the 12th century BC. Initial extraction sites and processing centers often coincided geographically. Major ore bodies and thriving forges appeared in places like the Caucasus, Taurus, as we said now, Noricum, Gaul, Iberia, even Britannia, as a matter of fact. A people known as the Kalubas, that I also made a video for the Achaemenid military historical units, for that matter, labeled, in fact, as a, quote, nation of smiths, and located among the southeastern Black Sea coast, essentially in ancient eastern Pontus, like modern northeastern Turkey, pioneered the insight that extended heating of iron in contact with charcoal yielded superior strength and toughness, right? Sources attribute this mostly. Ancient authors, including Aeschylus, for example, associate the Kalubas closely with early iron working, even name iron after them, the Kalubian iron. This is very interesting because these peoples were considered to be, like, these were essentially Caucasian peoples. They had an early connection with even peoples like the Cumerians, the same Scythians. So we are slightly later. Of course, there is all, again, from more or less those areas, even the Pontic steppe, very interesting developments. Some people debate that regarding the possible Scythian origin, or at least documentability of by their people chronology of the same stirrup, right? Which is another theme that we discussed, and it's more, as always, the indication of an intensification of cavalry, especially shock warfare, as opposed to an enabler of the same. So historical attributions can be also vague. We don't know, for example, how things really worked more in depth for Eastern Eurasia, right? Our Western sources are much better in general for different reasons. It's also interesting to see how these, for example, the Kalubas were not even probably a military power. They were just a provincial people, like the Noriki, for example, in today's Austria, were still pretty good steel, essentially, is extracted, at least if you consider that because by engineering standards today, not even ancient weapons, actual steel weapons, are considered steel, right? But those were adequately carbonized, and still in Austria, that kind of resources extracted from the same mines used by the Romans and their Celtic allies there. So it's quite fascinating. So the Kalubas were practically relevant in the bigger picture of the art of war. In fact, also in that video, I was telling you, even just politically or military at large, they didn't have much relevance, but they were at least connected with this broader Caucasian reality that is normally attributed, especially a great availability of raw material. We've seen it also in the videos, for example, about the Armenians, both in ancient medieval times. The Armenians had lots of iron, that they made large use of iron. That doesn't immediately translate into pretty darn good armor. That's yet another thing that we have to think when we look at ancient technology for those excellent swords that we often find, in fact, in the most elite, properly richer graves. there were so many that also went lost because were reused at some point, or at least they wouldn't necessarily bury their dead with that, or those burials are sort of much more difficult to find, which doesn't align with the fact that they would have been the majority. There would have been so many other swords that were so-so, they were good enough, and others that even legitimately sucked, together with also others that were pretty good anyway. There was probably a hierarchy, right? The better, the higher, the more powerful the knight in politics and war and society, the better weapon was meant to be, and hence the connection of the sword with royalty, as well as the alter ego of the warrior in general. Remember that the cingulum militaris, that is also what properly defines knighthood, that comes from the right of the Romans, of the freemen across Europe, to bear arms, was properly associated with a degree of divinity, of nobility, right? The right of bearing arms and using them, also in the Middle Ages, is normally associated with those peoples. Even the communes that could have standing armies on their own were definitely leaving a higher quality of life and power, as opposed to a guy living in a feudal society that was de facto a servant, somebody else's person, and was essentially demilitarized. Now, between approximately the 14th and 12th centuries BC, Hittite groups, that, as you know, are essentially an Anatolian people who built a major Bronze Age empire in modern Turkey from around 1600 BC, held exclusive command over iron production and shaping, pioneering smelted iron artifacts that marked an early transition toward the Iron Age. The Hittites were Indo-European. They were pretty darn good at chariot warfare. They were normally heavier, at least in their elite component. They were considered to be better at that kind of war. They sort of gave hell to people living in the Levant, for that matter. And that's also in part how the dissemination of these metallurgical skills widened. You find the Caucasus, Cyprus, and Crete feeling the effects of such expansion, which literally meant that many of these war bands came to conquer some of these places. For example, the fact that the Etruscans were apparently very advanced, like the first, probably the very first find of chainmail in Europe is not a Celtic thing, it's not even a Scythian thing, or at least we don't know where it would have emerged. It's well possible, in fact, normally something coming from the steppes, but it was found in Etruria, all right? And those may have easily been, as we've seen initially, at least as an establishment, some sort of groups of Hittite war bands that had brought about, in fact, one of the most sophisticated civilizations there in the Western Mediterranean at that point. In the European sphere, we're there, by the way, in the countries we just listed in the Levant around the 12th to 10th centuries BC. This is a very important time because it is exactly the moment, as I just said, in which the sea peoples were swarming across the Mediterranean. And these were essentially Indo-European war bands that were toughening up also in terms of infantry capacity. And so, paradoxically, spreading the use of arms and armor beyond a merely ultra-elite aristocratic dimension, because their infantries now were put in crisis chariot warfare, and so there was, if anything, a greater spread of heavier weapons at an unprecedented level. This is also the point, as we've seen, in which we can observe the so-called Dorian migration with all the sort of question marks of the case. I made an entire video essentially saying that, yeah, basically, the Dorian migration is not made up. It is actually true. It depends only on what kind of degrees and indicators you want to employ. This is the point at which, for example, the same italics, and so basically the last major and biggest Indo-European invasion of Italy with the settlement of the polities that we normally recognize later, such as, I don't know, the Latins, the Oscans, and so on, come around from essentially Central Europe, from, again, this is basically an Urnfield context in which further sort of corded ware and other, even the Yamnayas elements are spread further and settling the last major wave, probably what will eventually birth the Hellenic and the Roman civilizations. In fact, when you look at Italy and in the broader European sphere, it's interesting. And this is anecdotal because, again, it's based on discoveries, then things change here and there. But it's the Umbrians, so this Italic people in the heartland of the central Italian Apennines, that likely ranked among the first, at least, to introduce iron techniques to Italy. While Hellenic and Balkan pathways extended the knowledge to the Eastern Alps, and so where Noricum earned special fame as we said before, as an outstanding iron center, thanks partly to local ores, as we were recalling in today's Austria, that showed only trace sulfur and phosphorus, but generous manganese content, which boosted workability. Right, and the Noricum, as such, as a Celtic kingdom in the Eastern Alps, incorporated into the Roman Empire around 15 BC, for good had become renowned for producing high-quality steel iron due to its manganese-rich deposits supplying weapons across the Roman world from the late Republic onward, but already, at least, even if it's not fully documented, from quite a while. Right, so there were these hubs, properly, these cradles, capable of producing and sort of exporting in consistent ways, not just the pieces, but the same techniques, due to the easier sort of the proximity to particular ores or sort of the settlement of particular groups that were more expert already in that kind of metallurgical skill. From the 7th through 6th centuries BC, the craft pushed farther north into continental Europe and Gaul. Right? This sketch of metallurgical diffusion has been kept intentionally streamlined for expository purposes, intentionally omitting, for example, cross-influences like those from Danubian methods that were important as well. Those appear to have reached wider Asian traditions, particularly the Chinese one, via Caucasian intermediaries starting from the 9th century BC. This is incredibly interesting and important. We will make a video aside for telling you, as we were hinting at before, how literally what was being done in Europe, and also what, in this sense, was also developed in the center of it by the Proto-Celts, the Celts, was part of a broader net reaching literally like Eastern Eurasia, showing that Europe already was this powerhouse of metallurgical production, even though its peoples were not sort of cohesively statalized, or were barely beginning to head toward that direction, right? The fact that the Danubian course, especially in the lower part, is open to the steppes. It's something that remains for an incredibly long time. Even the Magyars during the Middle Ages had consistent connections with the Middle East in terms of arms and armor styles and more. So it's really an old intercontinental route that we're looking at, and that shows how there was always a similarity between peoples. I don't know, the Roman or Han arms and armor styles, production, etc. They weren't so far as we may think. Metallurgy instinctively calls to mind earthly and subterranean links, going back to an anthropological dimension. Yet its enduring celestial connections prove equally striking and persistent. Astrology, long the preeminent traditional science of the stars, in fact, as we've seen in the European theological series, that's entirely what this is. Like every single phoneme in our language derives from the description of a specific astrological movement, a celestial body, function, and sort of properly shift in the universe, forging tight bonds with alchemy. Later, we already said it, with the transformative craft of metals from the very beginning. In fact, when you look at, for example, the Chaldean observers in their tradition, the Kabbalah and so on, you realize that famously matched every planet to a particular metal. That's also much of our sort of traditional astrology also in the West is connected with. This arrangement is mirrored in Indian and Chinese cosmological systems alike, right? Because there was the obvious correspondence between the celestial and the earthly, right? And astrology wasn't separated from astronomy, for example, but it was metaphysically understood not much as today we understand in a superstitious sense the celestial bodies having an effect on the things like moment of the birth, etc., but essentially creating a correspondence between the two, right? So it's not a merely passive thing. The higher spheres, of course, are more impacting, but at the same time, you partake into them, not even your soul, but your body. Sumerians referred to iron as, quote, celestial metal, with an obvious reference to the meteorites, as much as the Egyptians calling it, quote, black copper of the sky. We'll get back to this also in the videos about Hermetic tradition, because this is not merely just like a material, natural observation, and sort of one divorce from a higher metaphysical concept, right? Linguistic connections further appear between the Hellenic term for iron and the Latin word for stars. Interestingly enough, myths in Aryan traditions consistently stress iron's heavenly meteoric character. They emphasize pairings such as the high sky god with the celestial craftsman, as we were recalling before for Woden, or lightning bolts. So from the same, in that sense, old, Godfather, Zeus, Jupiter, etc. Power-wielding capacities, projectiles of Uranic atmospheric divinities. In fact, also with divinely hammered tools that typically take axe or hammer form. Hence, there's hammer, which is the same thunderbolt, and that can sort of come to mean different things. The axe, for example, the Roman fasces that we explained is very much like the Nordic battle axe. We explained even the symbol of the cross, for that matter, along that pattern, which is not a hypothesis, it is how it literally happened. And so also for those who figure about Christianity arrived with a different symbol, no, it is the same symbol, and it also, especially in the Catholic tradition, elevates, right, the stake, right? And there is a literal shift between the two. Also theologically, within that same Catholic tradition of pre-Christian times. I made an entire video about this, from the Roman fasces to the Christian cross. Real-world observations surely reinforce these ideas. I mean, iron draws lightning, creating a perceived sympathy, for example. So it was essentially calling back like this vivifying power, right? Remember what we said before about the Soma, about sacred fire, about purification. We really talked about all this stuff in History of Religion quite recently. Well, this is what iron attracts, right? You can argue that the same knight covered in iron therefore attracts divine power in an electromagnetic sense. We don't know how many knights were in this sense not enough by being struck by an actual thunder in real life, but let's say that the correspondence was not like merely, okay, we have this material for protecting us on horseback. No, there was something higher about it. And the same fact that it was functional to that topological logic is all one inherently with metaphysical power, with the higher nature of the divine. Moreover, meteoric iron's earlier use in metalworking historically preceded mined sources, for obvious reasons. The sort of mineral extraction techniques and even practice resources know-how developed gradually. It was easier to sort of extract the sort of just fallen meteoric or superficial metals, lending additional weight to sky iron ties, probably in archaic times. If anything, also from a theological standpoint, the more recent the fall from heaven and the more loaded with divine power thing was. So paradoxically, look at how sort of this entire metallurgic but also theological knowledge turned into alchemy in the modern age, mostly focusing on something much more conceptualized also on the matters on the basis of, however, of the same chemistry and of actual sort of digging in the earth and so on, like, acquiring a much more modern secular vision and language, if anything, because this was obviously still a metaphorical and metaphysical concept, but there is a change, even in that sense, in the more immediate connection with the divine of the ancient compared to the one even like 1,000 years after now, that it's still in antiquity, but very, very different in spirit. In fact, attempts to explain these patterns through pseudo-rational presupposed logic tend to flatten intricate realities into shallow, misleading simplifications. Mythic perspectives uncover, if anything, far deeper, more resonant connections. Prometheus's grand saga, for example, the story of a tormented yet humanity-loving benefactor, ties inseparably, like its hero, to the jagged peaks of the wild Scythia. This distant edge of the world territory, while not identical to the Caucasus, closely resembles it and receives explicit designation as the motherland of iron. We very well explained this in the video about, in fact, the Urartians, the Cimmerians, even before the Scythians, because it's all entwined. It were basically the same regions. There was an exchange between the Caucasus and the Pontic steppe in the development of that knightly, other than just metallurgical culture. Now, interestingly enough, Prometheus's name etymology means literally forethinker, which, as we know, is associated with the same concept of providence, which is a not much an Asimovian or Vernian kind of approach to technology, but still essentially a way to that, because the power that is unlocked through this wisdom, essentially, of how to handle nature, which is at least still a mission to achieve, Catholically speaking, is truly providential in nature. I mean, Prometheus is, according to the more famous myth, tormented brutally for, say, with life and not life at that point, but in one version, famously enough, he's eventually saved by Hercules. And so that is the guy, for example, makes it into divinity, differently from basically any other hero in Hellenic tradition. And he sees Prometheus's achievement actually as something positive for mankind. So something that came with a burden, with a sin, with the discipline, at least the need, the must for discipline in order to handle technology, penalty, self-destruction, and with nuclear warfare, you eventually understand what that is the case. And that therefore makes you see also the development of quote-unquote modernity in very different times, in very different ways, from sort of the modernistic, say the attacked modernism that certain traditionalists made by claiming that basically everything modern or contemporary is just wrong. Instead, when we look at power wielding, that unsurprisingly the people of our era feel hysterically threatened by, that's actually the same indicator of divine power, or if anything, the titanic force that strives towards divinity. By the way, if you're interested in Prometheus, and if anything, we can talk about him in other instances, like look at Aeschylus, obviously, but the thing of iron, for example, appears as probably native to Scythia in the Seven against Thebes as well. So it's a very embedded mythological and, in this sense, also historical concept, right? The Greeks obviously had colonies in the Black Sea. There was also at some point a Scytho-Hellenic culture of some kind. It was very interestingly connected to those meteoric connections with God and a warlike culture and knightly exploit. Even though the Hellenes naturally saw the Scythians as barbarians, there's a word upside down, but we'll talk about that too, including about Amazonism and what that means in part in the history of mankind. in a traditional lens. Now, a quick review of the aforementioned Aeschylus's Prometheus underscores intertwined threads. Fire and sky gods. Zeus avenges himself on the fire stealer Prometheus. For example, metal forging. In the case of Hephaestus, the divine smith shackling the Titan to stone. An underworld element as well. Hermes, guide of souls, conveying Zeus's edict to the captive. And Hermes, as you know, also in alchemy, has a very specific role because it's basically the Holy Ghost himself, the guide of souls, in fact, unsurprisingly, and connected with probably Mercury as a malleable, volatile, but also quite powerful substance. As the primordial civilizer granting mortals fire, Prometheus himself displays divine smith traits shared with Hephaestus and analogous culture heroes in many traditional cultures. For example, the distant Chinese Yu combined mining with metallurgy. Turco-Mongol epics use Darkhan to signify both smith and hero, right? The Iranian tradition presents Smith Kavia's dynastic founder, his name linked to an Avestan root meaning wise at the same time. So he who sees, also in that providential sense that we were explaining before, that mean literally like the visots from the Germanic is the same Indo-European root of video in Latin, and is connected to that sort of spiritual vision. Right, so these guys knew essentially also what laid in the world and knew how to put it together to achieve power. Think about the Iranic, the Sarmatian deities covered in iron, right? Literally some sort of cyborgs, right? Centaurs of forces that blended everything that could exist on Earth by divine blessing in virtue of their individual power. One could also invoke the Celtic sun god Lugh, titled Saildanach, whose name conveys expertise across diverse fields: poetry, smithcraft, magic, combat, woodworking. This is essentially also what Druidic wisdom consisted of, right? A broader natural philosophy, mostly aimed at essentially war waging, political rule, and social prosperity, you can argue. So knowing a bit of everything, what especially a leader had to be able to wield. Natural and supernatural, peaceful and belligerent arts characteristically blended, as there was definitely a sense of hypostatic transcendence between the higher nature of God, the never-changing one, and the ever-changing one of the world. Prometheus commands hidden prophetic powers and envied by Zeus himself. Similarly, smiths across traditional worlds wield extra-natural magical gifts. They intone Carmina during work, songs that double as spells, making them poet, musician, magicians. For example, in Genesis 4:22, the Vulgata describes one of these, quote, qui fuit malleator et faber in cuncta opera eris et ferri, right? So was sort of the malleator, literally, knew how to mold and to literally create in all plenitude of this work, both bronze and iron, right? Later medieval tradition credited with music's invention as well. This is interesting because music magic links are broadly recognized. The medieval Bible interpretations adds a troubling layer to craft origins. Famously enough, they connect to Cain's line from the start, right? As God, after the killing of his brother, sends him outside in the world, dedicating himself to the craft. So a further sort of doubling down of original sin from their parents brought Cain, the sole survivor, think about that. And interestingly enough, in the Bible, that's not even the shepherd, right? So, there we don't have to take everything so sort of seriously in certain aspects, there is always a reason. Now, I don't want to digress into theological interpretation of that, but the most important thing to get away from this is that the smith, above all when making weapons, becomes a darkly formidable figure who crafts fratricides instruments. It's a broader synonym of warfare among men, endlessly renewing ancestral guilt in human history. At the same time, as we've seen in the European tradition, this guilt is actually transcended through the same bloodshed, paradoxically, because it's only coming back to it and purifying through the same blood that you can surpass that original stigma that obviously is also considered in the European theology as far as you are mortal, right? So a human, that happens because of your active sinning, as a matter of fact. But the connection between the smith's formulas, so to say, and rhythm in his craft is definitely connected with poetry, with music, because there was essentially a way to train these people through truly sacred texts that called divine power on this worthy enterprise, and that not just gave the proper tempo for sort of striking the metal and giving time properly to wait in every process, but they were truly meant to infuse a divine power in this world itself. And it was mostly considered, as you know, as the craft of this netherworlders hidden from the rest of the world. Still, in the later Middle Ages, anthropologically, the figure of the smith was a dark one always suspected to be colluded with witchcraft, with the darker, knowing the darker forces of the earth's bowels, and so on. So an etheric figure. And this is always necessary because these were still the people who provided their masters, the knights, the lords, the princes, with the finest weapons. And so historically, there were also in the retinues of these men to begin with, right? Ties among shamans, heroes, and smiths receive clear attestation in both Indo-European and Turco-Mongol contexts, with the Finnish Kalevala offering a notable example, chanting karmina, so literally poetry, while forging hints at ritual persistence alongside practical timing. Could these utterances have paced work stages? Of course, might the signal early steps toward advanced processes such as differential tempering? Yeah, we're definitely certain smiths, like warrior heroes and shamans, experience initiatory trials themselves. Remember that traditional society was an enormous guild. It was an enormous mystical body where every community had its own sacred rites that they performed, say, autonomously from the hierarchy, because without them, there could have not been the entire body to begin with. And everything obviously was hopefully directed towards a single purpose, together with the head of this mystical body. But you see, everyone had their own function. And some of these mysteries were definitely pretty dark, because in order to provide with properly the material, the capacitor, there were even properly bloody things to do, sort of pretty risky ones from a hygienic standpoint. The same fire, the same instruments. It was all a dangerous business. As a matter of fact, it was a costly one in terms of the materials, finding, etc. I think how sort of interconnected even these guilds could be, right? The relative communities constituted a restricted group transmitting guarded professional knowledge that must not be shared externally, right? Just yesterday was correcting a text, was translating a text more than else, that was talking about a master of cleavers being killed in a battle during the 14th century. And obviously we can imagine his men also being equipped in the clash with cleavers. And cleavers also, this is more like bird dishes of some sort. in the source, even though the etymology is the same one. Manaria, for example. Iron and its maker acquire an aura of mystery that generates two contrasting mythic ritual attitudes in traditional cultures. One celebrates them as supernatural originators of civilized life, the other fears them as conduits of hazardous powers, leading to their segregation, avoidance, and dread. Very much like Cain, that, however, is also the same creator of worlds. Is the one who experiments, who builds cities, that is volley into that mechanism of power. Indeed, especially in feudal societies where lords were seen, as in the Parsifal, angels who killed everything they touched, you can imagine the inherent bloodshed potential that these wars really had. Like, there were properly, in Aeschylus, in talking about Prometheus, who was the first one who forged this war, the terrible war. Like, his heart was hard as iron. Something I'm paraphrasing, but I mean, it was as cold as the same weapon, right? There's something terrifying about technology. And this is absolutely relatable. I was saying before, think about any kind of military technology, but even like the potential that we can really unleash, deriving from the deeper understanding of atoms, of subatomic particles, and the sort of the structure of matter. All right. Ancient Hellenic mythology groups figures like Telkines, Cabeiri, Curetes, and Dactyls in close relation to underground realms, frequently cave-dwelling, metal crafts, music and dance, rhythms, magical arts, mystery initiations, and rites for young males. In this sense, there is an openly Dionysian, chthonic, telluric dimension. And this is indeed something low, right? These people deal literally with matter, with dirt, with the netherworld, with its sort of very, it's material and physical, right? It's looking properly at the secrets of the terrible Mother Earth that swallows her own children. It has to do with humus, with decomposition. There were some methods to sort of sharpen sword blades that were very, they were dealing with pretty disgusting material and so on. So just to stress how even impure this mechanism is. In Nordic tradition, you know very well that basically the Ragnarok actually occurs because the Aesir at some point asked the Nibelungs, so the lesser race at that point of the earth dwellers, to create, so that are properly identified as myths and other sort of engineers, to help them build the Asgard that is all in gold, and that thus the supreme material, like the pure spirit, the untouchable one that can be very easily contaminated by even minimal sin, and that therefore curses the citadel of the gods. It will be stormed at some point. You don't know what is going to happen in the end time in that regard. It's the age of the wolf. And so it's the same sort of snake at the roots of the world that moves in these crevices of the netherworld itself that you may encounter, just like the dragon in the cave, right? So it's all very, sometimes heroes do descend to this netherworld. We have actually seen how in practice, and this is very much there, think about Odysseus, think about Aeneas, there is always this descent into the netherworld, into hell, as a form of initiation, of ritual death and regeneration that was at the root of all these mechanisms. In the Norse sagas, you also find, again, the committance of those weapons that descend naturally among the dwarves. So everything is very anthropologically clear, very symbolically evoking, but it's scary. Right, it's something you really have to be skilled in order to find. And I also made a video, by the way, about the slumbering monarchs in German folklore in the Middle Ages, where we've seen how essentially some, also usually pure beings like children, for example, bringing food from a place to another in the countryside, enter these mountains and they find, and also smiths for that matter, that's also interesting. So they're not so pure necessarily per se. And they see inside these mountains where the great ruler rests some marbles that, for example, those giants that throw at each other this massive iron ball that naturally would have been very difficult to craft to begin with. And there is all a magical force that there is quite double-edged, can kill you as much as reward you. There is probably a path to follow, some very specific things to answer. This shows you the danger of the etheric dimension, a chthonic one, that you must be able to master, however, in order to achieve divinity and to turn that into gold in the actual world. And it's all there. It's from this most ancestral mythology to modern alchemy. These metaphors, these images, these roles are all there. All right. Makers of divine weaponry for gods and heroes invariably display in their stories a profound merging of celestial, so Uranic, and earthly, that is chthonic, sacred spheres. A telling illustration appears in the cult of Zeus Dolichanos, that is one of the most beautiful as atmospheric deities, wielding a double axe. Essentially, what you see, by the way, in the crypt with Saint Joseph, etc., was already like from the other side, from the other, the Virgin. So the bull and donkey is an incredibly millenary old symbolism duo, right? And naturally, that's the sacrificial act of the sacrificial bull, and so that abated, defeated masculine rival force. From the other side, you have the chthonic one transcended. Zeus stands, in fact, on the bull as much as Juno Regina stands on the donkey, as a matter of fact, as a transfigured element herself, as we've seen as the chthonic symbolism of the Mother Earth, that, however, is elevated by the marriage with Zeus in there, right? So you understand how deep and powerful these symbols are. Right. I also inserted, by the way, references to all these things in the images, as you've seen. Originally venerated in Commagene in Syria, but because we know more specifically of sanctuary there and a attested tradition, but Zeus Dolichanos was eventually connected, as you understand here, with Thor, with the thunderbolt, with everything. It was part of all the universal tradition. He later entered, in fact, the Roman imperial military patronage as Lord of Thunder and Storms. All right, and we say later because, again, it mostly came as a style of worship from the East, but it's like saying, that Mithras arrived to Rome and that the Romans did not know what the Sol Invictus was before. The Sol Invictus appears in 4th century BC Sabina in central Italy. It had hardly anything to do with the Persians or the Indians, that actually Mithras is essentially one of the Dioscuri of the Vedic pantheon that eventually sort of earned this even higher offshoot in the Iranian tradition that eventually late antiquity arrived more directly to Rome in that west. But the only actual connection at the root was the same Indo-European ancestral concept that these peoples all shared from their ancestors in a sort of common background. Worshipped in a region, however, metallurgically productive since Hittite times, such as Commagene, Jupiter Dolichanos, or Zeus Dolichanos for that matter, attracted reverence from groups classically renowned for timeless smithing skill. Literally, again, this was a cult that had to do with the metallurgy itself as part of the initiative. Unfortunately, we don't know very much, but the symbolism is striking, and we do know that there were actual activities, as we said before, also in our sort of Christian folklore of Saint Egidius and so on, like connected specifically, like you had the tutelar deity, or that, say, a deity that you worshipped in that way locally that became sort of mistaken, as modern people think, as a different one for every place. Like that's not true at all. That protected communities that had that specific function. Just like, I don't know, in Aphrodisias, that it was an actual city where sacred prostitution was legal and, in this sense, patronized by the same Aphrodite, right, in Anatolia. So just for saying how truly guild-like and powerful, by the way, these movements and cults were locally and in this broader world, how much at the same time the origin was shared. Legends claimed that Zeus Dolichanos inaugurated metalworking and that his cult reached the same Commagene carried by northern smith peoples that are the same Calubus, as a matter of fact. They're not very distant in the north. They're just few, some hundreds of kilometers across the very impervious Mashrek Caucasus territory. As you understand, they're also very close peoples in different ways. I can't stress enough how during the Bronze Age, Mesopotamia and its surroundings was heavily impacted, to say the least, by continuous Indo-European infiltration, including massive Scythian raids, etc. And so you see how everything returns to Caucasus, the Cimmerians, the Scythians, the Calubus, the Commagene, they're all in a row, essentially, from a geographical point of view. And they are also connected with other regions, famous, as we've seen, for metallurgy all around, from Persia to the Eastern Mediterranean, etc. Post Cyrus the Great, this probably pre-Hittite figure of Zeus Dolichanos underwent, and by the way, however it was called at the time, because this is before the Zeus intended, probably in an Hellenic tongue, again, that comes from Deus Pater, and it's shared by all Indo-Europeans. Again, but these places, even though heavily Indo-Europeanized to a degree, especially in the outskirts of Mesopotamia, again, had all a different language and tradition at different times from at least the other branches of the Indo-European. One in part were also Semitic. And in fact, when after Cyrus the Great, this figure underwent Mazdaik reinterpretation, equating the same with the same aura Mazda and linking to Mitra. Surprise, surprise. Right? So it's basically a connection with Odin, with Thor, and it's impossible to unsee the mechanism. Alexander's Hellenistic influence only strengthened the emphatically Uranian character of this cult, confirming him as Zeus at that point, also because Alexander was the son of Zeus for that matter. Aeschylus's 7 against Thebes already calls iron Calybian, right? A literary commonplace echoed in Ammianus Marcellinus 22:8. Though Hellenes attributed Telchines, Caberi, Curetes, and Dactyls that we were mentioning before to Samothrace, Phrygia, or Lydia, their roots likely lay in fact further northeast, in areas like Colchis and broader Transcaucasia, where in fact some of the earliest knightly and metallurgical developments were occurring. Again, I made a specific video in particular about this, about the Cimmerians, the Scythians, and Transcaucasia. Naturally, this was a crossroad of so many different regions, cultures, continents. You understand this very well. Without mentioning, as we explained before, that the lower Danubian world was very much connected with Macedon, right? There was an important arms and armor production availability. For example, the Getae historically imported a lot of arms and armor from Hellas in general, and that was, as we've seen, in contact also with the Scythians trade-wise, and they were all very, very close with one another. You know, the Dacians themselves were very much in contact and also hosting some certain steps, elements among them, even pretty late times during, for example, the Roman conquest of their same land. They had enormous mineral resources that the Romans had been eyeing. So imagine how entwined this whole thing really was, and how sort of, even for Alexander to conquer the Achaemenid Empire was a sort of coming back, I can say to the origins, but definitely fighting against the Sakas, like sort of vibing in ways that he would have probably circlingly experienced fighting against the Celts, the Thracians, and the Scythians in the Balkans, for that matter. You understand how also frontier these areas would remain. We made multiple videos about, for example, Roman-Persian wars, and Commagene is always kind of in between. It's a sort of feudal, small feudal state between the Romans and the Persians. In fact, contact with Sarmatians and Parthians quickly revealed to the Romans, in these instances, the excellence of nomadic cavalry alongside the high quality of their equipment, defensive pieces, foremost, starting with scale or lamellar protection. Remember that the Romans had actually access to some of the finest arms and armor production out there, right? But in this sense, they mostly imported it, right? Italian metallurgy wasn't, let's say, here, it wasn't as advanced, for example, the one of Iberia, from which also the Gladius Hispaniensis sort of, quote-unquote, comes from. We've seen the same for Noricum still. The Romans imported metals, even from China, right? So remember what I said before, also between Rome and the Hands, saying that, again, these were more or less developed countries from a metallurgical point of view. I think it tells it all. It's just like saying the Celts had sort of particularly advanced metallurgy, and the Germans, the Romans, sort of inherited that, collected that legacy over time, if anything, because they sort of conquered the Celts themselves. But you can't say in that sense that the Celts overall are more advanced than the Romans, nor that Rome, in that sense, was scarce of metallurgic capacity to any. They had good enough metallurgy like all peoples around, and just certain areas were better known for that. So to make the case that the Romans weren't particularly sort of skilled in metallurgy, or by the time which they met the Sarmatians and the Parthians, they had to reconsider their metallic sort of protection, is perhaps too far-fetched. Like, there are all these things, they adopted the so-called sort of the segmented armor because, they suddenly went in these. First of all, they constantly used auxiliaries from those same places, so they didn't even need to, their legionary infantry was excellently armored, for that matter. So even if maybe, even by the time of the modern reform, a greater standardization, even assuming that ever happened in terms of properly uniforming the legionary infantry in an equal armoredness, which is actually very debatable and also a bit against evidence, the quality of iron may have decayed because it was more cheaply produced, right? Aside from the fact it was still bronze around in general, but there can be very different swings in variations, really, in quality for everything, right? It may be true that the Romans hadn't really thought that much about metallurgy more than other peoples. As we've seen, the Calibers were famous for that. The Noricans were for that. But were they powerful, developed peoples overall? Not much at all. So let's always maintain an eye, and never on military quality that is hardly ever about technological skill, right? It is, if anything, technological capacity enhances performance that is already pretty sound if you are able, like the Romans, by the way, to sort of absorb all various different techniques, styles, skills, but at that point, because they're already as advanced as the peoples that they're conquering in general terms, and even improving on them. And this was typical. This is something that the Romans themselves put around as a vision of themselves, because in practice, especially when their historiography had been fully developed and therefore had to vibe with the Hellenic one, but the Romans didn't really conquer the world because they needed, or they did it because they had more advanced technologies. Many people would like them to believe. So of the two, one, right? Either you want to presume that there were other peoples that were so much more technologically advanced than the Romans stole that from them, or the question is, again, if those were so technologically advanced, why did Rome win to begin with, and how would have that been, in fact, a hallmark of technology, a hallmark of civilizational advancement that you have to be honest about things, and things were actually much more homogeneous than we think here. Mostly studies dealing with where did metallurgy develop the most, where it spread, are a bit too deterministic, to sort of materially influenced by the same archaeological backgrounds, by people who maybe are extremely competent in their field but do not quite understand much the art of war, the broader social-cultural background, especially when this disciplines boomed. Like, they were informed with still a great sense of sort of materialistic and structuralistic bias. Now things are slightly changing, but it's not much about their bias, but how much of the previous moral understanding of history was lost in the process that matters. Besides, when you look at peoples from, again, the most metallurgically, you can't even say affluent, because there were poorer societies in general, the Iranian, think about the nomadic ones, you realize that in fact for them, producing such gear required patient, masterful alloy work whose malleability and toughness endured the harshest combat tests, but for this reason cost a freaking lot, right? The reason why the nomads developed the cataphract is that they're largely, by their own standards, a feudal society. And that, of course, like for one guy of that kind, you had many guys that practically did not even have metal armor. And that's something, pretty substantially documented. That's also why they remained always sort of fringe peoples compared to sanitary civilizations in general, right? And so never consider in this sense the steps, oh my god, they were so advanced, they invented, or they didn't even pioneer necessarily themselves the initiatory metallurgical development. It's just that they refined it for the specific pressure needs from the pressure they had in coping with the world in the steppes and against sanitary peoples. That sort of makes more sense. So the question in this sense is also, what models did guide Iranian and Turco-Mongol smiths? Naturally, it's a big question, so because we're talking different times, or other than just different places, they're also differently documented. So by treating fire as sacred and applying initiatory professional lore, they definitely mirrored cultic forms in war gear. We understand that they didn't think much in terms of how to achieve this in a practical sense only, but what that meant for them in a higher spiritual sense, and how did this serve particular models of leadership and just military action. One revealing instance illustrates this, that among the Xiongnu, because this is what we're told from Eastern sources, and nomadic horsemen generally, invention of the metallic armored garment stayed bound to deep roots. Technical advance here essentially rested fundamentally on religious representations inherited from antiquity. And so it's not like there wasn't an actual know-how connected with that religious view. This is what moderns have the greatest difficulty to understand, is that the same religious view was the precondition and guarantee for that practical capacity. Hence, tradition and what is passed down by trying to imitate that divine perfection and therefore also sort of earthly robustness that the armor and all the incredibly developed and sophisticated and complicated work in order to create it entailed. There was probably an asset in the smiths and their experience, a lifetime spent not just crafting but preserving knowledge. Right? Just think how proud these people were, how worth this really was. We can't see it even in today's world with sort of the cost of military technology. We've seen it in many instances, in many groundbreaking moments. Just the other day we were talking about, the monster bomber that Orban sold to the Ottomans for the siege of Constantinople, that the Byzantines simply at that point could not afford because they barely controlled the city. Surroundings at that point, and the same Theodosian walls could not take the recoil of those massive guns. And we'll talk more about populations like this. For example, the Xiongnu that we just mentioned as sort of this Turco-Mongol people. We just recently made a video about Han Xiongnu warfare, where, as you know, at this point, a powerful nomadic confederation dominating the Eastern Eurasian steppes from the 3rd century BC to the 1st AD, and known for their mounted archery, lamellar armor innovations, and shamanistic practices that included iron ornaments on ritual garments to ward off or control spirits at the same time. These could be literally studded armor, for that matter, as much as, for example, bells that were tied to the horses' bardings, and that were meant essentially to catch this divine power in the ether by ringing with the divine wind, and also the cosmic magnetic forces and power would attract the Holy Ghost on the victorious hero, right? And this connection between the religious knowledge and the practical know-how, the military know-how at large, provides a vital foundation for any theoretical and practical understanding of these subjects. Sacred conceptions and technical abilities originally intertwined intimately, yet techniques development gradually loosened those links, veiling original unity and desacralizing the craft, which is completely normal. It doesn't happen for this specific thing. It happens for whatever was happening in mankind throughout the ages, and pretty uniformly. Like, the world had a broader spiritual ghost that literally scaled down in divine intensity, as prophesied, again, ushering in the age of the wolf. Hence also the lower superstitious aspects that we find still in pretty recent societies. Shamanism, that people say, oh my god, shamanism, because the old original beliefs of where, that is the case if you look at properly very ancestral times, and we don't even know what was happening in those times in traditionally wise, meaning that actual power, who did actually have that, like what happened in terms of the fall, right? What happened to humans developing? It's not entirely clear at all, right? But in more recent times, when people even trying to reconstruct certain specific practice, you realize certain peoples are just, if devoid of power, as most shamanism remains fringe in the world, it's like what kind of capacity exists out there. Shamans constantly decorated robes with iron pieces, sometimes densely enough to conceal underlying fabric. These functioned as amulets capturing benevolent spirits for service and safeguarding on talismans, repelling and intimidating hostile ones. Right? How far such practices survive today, by the way, is unclear in the sense that we explained what they originally meant. Right? But we should also ask ourselves, as far as we can document shamanism at some point in the past, what were exactly these shamans about? It's not clear, right? It's not clear if other powers existed in terms of initiatory activation that we don't see. The shaman could be some relatively fringe. Look, if modern anthropology mostly developed this idea of the shaman even as, I don't know, a sexually ambiguous guy, semi-outcast out there, and surely also a scary person with some particular sensitivity, but in practice, right? How much, for example, that survives today, and how much owes that to just a modernization or secularization, and how much owes it to a transformation of power manifestation, because it's not just like there's a shaman that's tradition. We may be that's why I deeply believe, the actually, at this point, unaware carriers of tradition as a bigger civilization, so that this is practically diluted to non-awareness among the single individuals, but not in what they actually produce. And so it's complicated. I will not enter anthropology here more than much, but for example, iron ornaments hold special prominence among Siberian peoples, where armor-like protection is evident. Plates guard against evil spirit strike. But this was done also to an extent with tattoos, for example. How much of tattoos that we can document in some still historical times, especially after with the start of the Common Era, were understood at the time as an actual connection with God, or just some form of apotropaic sort of, let's hope I won't be hit, I have a tattoo just because I'm too poor not to have armor, for example. It's impossible to draw the line, syncretically speaking, but the intensity by which this was believed is what we can't quite measure. Because again, by the Common Era, peoples in that we normally attribute this more quote-unquote ancestrally pure kind of background, often were actually pretty canonically oriented and anti-imperial Catholic tradition-wise. Like, they lived at the fringe of the empire, they feared it and were subordinated to it anyway. So what kind of, say, of course, within societies were those who knew how to wield power and exercise, but as far as the practices among also the followers, those guys, as we've seen at the beginning, were exhausting themselves towards the support of a more, in fact, were demilitarizing in favor of a more elite guy, following a higher and purer and stainless, so also tattoos-wise, kind of path. It's very, very difficult to tell, or at least we can't guess it. This is my theory. I've always sort of pointed, like in this case, like out what I believe based on which dynamic that is consistent with our understanding of tradition and history at the same time. We know that Altaic shaman costumes feature metal parts meant specifically to scare spirits. So yeah, and they surely maintain the same belief, but how much, again, of the activation of this practice is alive? Because that's what old tradition is about. How did they actually get into this, right? Is it just copying, like passing down what you have to wear and believing loosely that, yes, the divine power is in that? But it's like, even if you look at modern Christianity, I mean, ancient medieval Christians believed much more intensely and deeply and in an immediate sense in their connection with divinity compared to Christians today. It's the same religion, but how much of the collective spirit is truly enabled throughout historical years. Iron clutter during shamanic dance formed a key element in mastering spirits. Remember, it's always about divine connection through the attraction of sort of electromagnetic force and capacity. It's the same reason likely why even certain massive monuments of antiquity were built the way they were, without any sort of conspiratorial idea. It's obvious that if you put gold at the top of the pyramids, that's the best, by the way, gold for a reason among different others, that sort of excellent electricity conductor. And so at that point, why gold and not iron? Well, because maybe we live in the Iron Age, and so literally we're already degenerated that much. So it's very complicated because there isn't even just meteoric stuff, right? Metals are understood in sort of a wider range of employability. So that even if we look at the period of higher sort of metallurgical development, we realize it's basically the Bronze Age, not much the iron one, from the meteors. There is also the recalling the racket of cavalry arms clashing on march and charge. This sound, as we said before, the little bells, right, ringing at the passage of heavenly wind, right? But there are medieval texts citing similar sounds, fueling the mounted warrior's aura of sacred terror. There was also a lot of music involved, telling the truth. This hadn't only to do with metal, but the dreadful din of arms and armor was always something. Modern scholarship states that traditional combat cultures treat pre-battle intimidation as essential, which is actually correct. following ritual schemas closely paralleling spirit subduing. There were veritable acrobacies that, for example, a Totila before battle in front of the Ostrogothic host and the Byzantine opponents would do in a specifically golden armor that he wouldn't use for combat, by the way. So you can imagine just what this thing was all about. In any case, clothing, cries, movements, and similar means were skillfully exploited in a deep psychological sense, because of course it's all about controlling the spirit rather than the matter that itself is just like a conductor, really. The smith crucially crafts these shamanic amulets that not only weapons per se, right? Smiths and shamans, both holders of initiatory wisdom, both lords of fire, for that matter, dominating that element. Think about horseshoeing, we said before, with Eligius's Legion, for example, referring to that, and the shamanic trance of the horses clopping in its frenetic, etheric cavalcade. It's all one with the handling of sacred fire at the end of the day in the abyss, in the darkness. That is where, as we know, so theologically, God is reborn from the lowest of the abyss. And so, paradoxically, is if the deeper you went in the abyss, and sort of the most dangerous, of course, but the more dangerous, but the more effective you mastered adequately. And so these figures share profound ability, affinity, summoned up in the Yakut proverb that goes, quote, smiths and shamans come from the same nest. The shaman could potentially be delegated to the lower aspects of religion as opposed to the highest ones that traditionally point at the higher figures in terms of sheer power. That is achieved also through initiatory rites that do seem like shamanic. Also, the shaman really acquires that capacity once he goes out in the world and sort of either never comes back or remains there for some reason. It's a bit the same concept as the war band and so on, but if you trace the parallelism between the smith and the shaman, you realize that the smith is another netherworldler. All right, and he touches properly like this lower nature. And here aside that we're talking about the Yakut people, but sort of this aligns pretty much with what we understand about metallurgy, smiths, etc. Also I think about also saying Nordic saga, in Prometheus, and so on. Well, you understand that this seems like a lower function. In other words, if you are really wrestling with God, you navigate on much higher waves, so to say. Now, the same hands forged nomad armor for Turco-Mongol and Iranian riders in the steppes, practical metallic protection, arrows resistant above all, because that's how, at least practically, would fit also for fighting against one another with all that horse archery. Yet typologically near shamanic ritual dress and likely intended as liturgical in turn, vestments to ward off that spirit's pledges of sacred invulnerability. But you don't parry a blow just with sort of little plagues here and there, right? That's how distant we are from actual power. And so it seems really more like a chthonic superstition than anything. Conversely, traditional forms enduring long with reciprocal influences suggest that, at least originally, shamanic attire was itself conceived and named as armor, right? So it could well be that before the shaman, as we anthropologically know it in far more modern times, and before even the same phase in which they could have been smiths themselves, and so being their real armor in previous times, God knows what kind of evoking function they really had, right? It's really unclear and difficult to browse. Now, thus, warrior and shaman, in any case, earthly battle and spirit warfare, human enemies and supernatural threats merge symbolically. Because at the end of the day, if you know the world, you can do it also as a leader, and that's why, for example, the sort of lay and spiritual power at some point were held by a single person. And so at that point, the separation, even in functions and specialties, wasn't really needed in the unitary divine aspect. And so the suspicion there is that the more you go back in time, at least this is what tradition suggests, and one can think what they want. It was actually an increasing elevation in the function. War transformed into sacred contest, the bellum sacrum, every clash of psychomachy. This equation long preceded supportive texts describing properly their theology and interpretation from organized religions as we know them in modern terms. But they were part of the same imperial Catholic tradition that all these peoples actually shared. Christianity among them, but on the trail, in fact, of much older ones. In this, I think we can sort of rejoice. We will talk again about similar topics that may seem or sound strange in the way they're presented, but they're actually sort of perhaps the best insight that we can have at the moment on these topics, because I frankly don't know anyone who studies both the religious and the military aspect combined, and it seems to me, as we said today, that this is in any case the best way to properly enter that. I mean, it's not a secret for anyone that this is the case, but the actual meaning of it is another story. And it seems as moderns we have largely abandoned this for some reason. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.